Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 356 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is Andrew Kidd, a BACP Senior Accredited Counsellor, EMDR Europe Accredited Practitioner and author. In this first of a two-part conversation, Andrew pulls back the curtain on EMDR therapy, explaining its foundations, how it works, and why so many consider it a truly 21st century approach to trauma. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very warm welcome. It is episode 356 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes, my colleague, and myself, Ken Kelly, walking you through 3 stops on today's journey, starting off with ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about when clients lie. This is an interesting topic. Been doing some research and I'm excited to dive a little bit deeper into that. We then go into practice matters. Rory's already beautifully teed that up where he spoke with Andrew Kidd about EMDR. We have so many people in our Facebook group speaking about this topic. So here it is. You ask, we listen. Rory's bringing that to you today. And then in student services, where we recognize you students on your journey to become counselors, psychotherapists, or to gain the skills to use in your life and job. Today we're going to be speaking about AI and plagiarism in counselling. I think it is timiest that we speak about this, and what does that mean to you and your study journey? But let's kick it off, Rory. The topic I'm excited for today in this episode 356, where we're talking about when clients lie in therapy. Surely a client would never lie, Rory.
Well, I think the thing is, I think we all do from time to time. I was having a Garibaldi with my Earl Grey the other day, and I found myself saying to myself, oh, it doesn't really matter. There's very few calories in that. And of course it was a lie. I like my Garibaldi, but I was trying to justify having one, even though I should be watching my calories at my tender time in life. So I think we have to admit that we all tell lies, but I think when it becomes a bit of an issue in the therapy room is where it becomes absolutely clear that the client isn't telling the truth. And this can be seen maybe when they tell you a story in one session and then they forget what they've told you and tell you a completely different story about the same thing in the other session. Because if you do tell lies, you need a really good memory. And it can be a bit off-putting for a therapist because, we're taught in training that this is all about the truth and revealing our truth. But when clients are not being honest, it can be very, very tricky. And I think what we're going to be doing today, Ken, is we're going to be talking about some of the reasons why clients may not be comfortable telling the truth.
100%. Beautifully introduced there, Rory, as well. So thank you very much for that. So I want to bring in another word here for lying. I want to say lying or concealment, because that can be a form of lying. And I delved into a little bit of AI research on this topic, Rory, and I found a couple of quotes which are interested, done from some research, and we can share these links in the show notes if you're interested in digging a little bit deeper. Lying or concealment by clients in therapy is very common. One survey of 547 psychotherapy clients said 93% of the clients said that they told an untruth. And then there was another study, and it found that 56% of clients reported some degree of lying to their therapist or a deception in therapy. And we'll put links to those so you can go and look at them a little bit deeper. But I think that frames it beautifully, where we can say, never, a client would never lie in therapy. They're coming in because they want to grow and to develop. But it is all very common, as you quite rightly framed, Rory, as it is in life. We maybe put ourselves forward differently to how we truly are. And I think it's accepted in the world. You'll hear people saying, well, if you're not lying on your CV, then you're not doing it properly. And those kind of things are the things that we hear. And it seems like being untruthful or hiding parts of ourselves are ways of being successful in everyday life. And I guess we all do that at some level. However, within therapy, we want to welcome the entirety of that person into therapy to be seen as they truly are. And it's not often in life we get to show up truly as we are. So it's no wonder that a client might want to hide something from themselves. And I think understanding the lying, it's not necessarily a blatant untruth that this person is deliberately telling you. It may be that they're just trying to hide a part of self that they don't feel is acceptable. It may have been that they have a journey that shows them that telling the truth within their family environment leads to unrest. It leads to them being hurt. It leads to really unpleasant outcomes. So therefore, being a little untrue from time to time is a survival mechanism for that person. So I think we frame it by saying that we need to tread very carefully when somebody is speaking to us, and we maybe pick up something that doesn't ring 100% true from perhaps something they said earlier. As you beautifully said there, Rory, we can forget and then restate something quite differently. Yes. We wouldn't want to be rushing in and going, hold on a second, I think you've been lying to me because you said. So how would we, I guess, gently handle that, Rory?
Yeah, so I think the first position, certainly from a person-centered position, is all behaviour is goal-directed. Rogers said that. And if we have that in the forefront of our mind, that this behaviour of not being truthful is a way of protecting self, is a way of maybe going through an historic pattern of behaviour where it wasn't safe to tell the truth. And many years ago, I'll share a very quick story. I had a client who came because he'd been caught out telling lies. And he said, I just have trouble with the truth. He said, I just have trouble with the truth. And when we started to kind of dig around, he one day came and he said, when I was a little, 5, 6, 7, my father was very angry and a very violent man. And anything that happened, someone spilled a cup of tea or the general things that go wrong in a house, he would hit the roof. And my mother encouraged me to lie about it, to stop an argument. And this became so normalized in their house that what happened was that when he grew up, it became very normalized for him to tell lies because the truth equals a bad outcome. That's the thing. All behavior is goal-directed. The truth equals a very, very bad outcome. So it's easier to stay away from the truth, to stay away from that bad outcome. And it is, in fact, a trauma response. Now, your question about how we deal with it. Well, I think that you're absolutely right, Ken. What we don't do is we say, hang on a second, last week you said this and now you're saying that. Are you telling the truth? Because that isn't the way we should be dealing with clients. What we should be doing is, first of all, exercising, I think, wisdom And we should hold in our mind that why is this pattern of behavior evolving in the therapy room? And just wait. And what will happen? There will be an opportunity where, for instance, someone was I remember banging the arm of the chair with their fist and saying, I'm not angry at all about it. And I said, you say you're not angry, but I noticed that you're nearly knocking the arm of the chair off with your fist. And I just left it there. And it was an incredible pivoting point in that relationship, because I gently held the mirror up. And what happened was the client realized that actually I'd seen this kind of incongruence, which is what we're talking about. And I didn't over challenge, I didn't criticize, I didn't judge, Ken. I didn't judge. Yeah. And that opened the gateway for a very interesting piece of work through the arc of that encounter.
Yeah, I think that didn't judge. There's the key, Rory. There's the absolute key of that. And, we've already looked that there's generally a reason behind why this person may be concealing or putting a different version of themselves forward. And what's interesting, a little bit more research that I came across, is that it is suggested that therapists are not very good at spotting or detecting untruths in a client. And I when I saw that, I thought, you can't pull the wool over my eyes. When I look in my emails, I'm always looking out for the spam. But then I realized when I was in a therapeutic setting, I'm there with this unconditional positive regard. There's not a filter going, hold on a minute, I wonder if what they're telling me is the truth or not. I'm trying best I can to be in their frame of reference. So it's interesting that we might not be that good at picking it up, but I think you've beautifully said, Rory, that it may show itself in clues that just don't ring true. We might have a felt sense inside, go, that seems to be a little bit different. And maybe there's an incongruence in that, and we're certainly in the person-centered model, we're shown highlighting congruence. If a person says one thing and feels a different thing, we might reflect on that incongruence within that person. And and a common example of that is, I shouldn't really be feeling like this, my life is actually fine and everything's going and there's nothing to be afraid of, yet I'm feeling this deep anxiety. And we could go to that, how you see it, yet how you feel it. And maybe that same kind of very gentle approach can be used if we do find that something doesn't ring true, but it only works as does any form of challenge, because it is a gentle challenge. It only works within a strongly formed relationship. And there's the work within this, is in working on that relationship to the point where maybe that client will feel a little bit safer. Maybe they will start showing more of their true self, bits of their self they've never shown to anyone. They've always shown a different version. You may be the first to receive that. And we attend to those clues, and we can ask clients questions. If we feel maybe something is not right, this client might be holding back, we might ask them, how does this space feel to you? Does it feel like a safe space? What can we do to make this a space where you can bring your 100% true self? And we can use those gentle words of speaking about the self, the person, the human, the real person behind what they may be bringing. So maybe in their words there might be levels of incongruence, but we see the person underlying that as that wonderful human that is, like you say, Rory, acting from a goal directive position. And I think, Rory, some of the reflections as we kind of, before I hand back to you, as we go into this, is we might think to ourselves of, in our practice, what are those functions of a client maybe concealing or lying to us? Why might they do that? And I think that's a really good place for us to start by understanding what that means for us and helping us, I guess, gain that empathy towards that client, Rory.
Yes, and I think I've certainly supervised practitioners who've felt a little, shall we say, hurt or wounded that they're working really hard with this client and the client's not being honest with them. And I think the first position is that clients should be able to tell lies in therapy. It's their time, it's their space to be whoever they want to be. And what we shouldn't be doing is policing clients. However, when the opportunity arises, and I think this is the pivot and the key for me, is to gently challenge that incongruence. And also, I do think that the reasons for lying may lie in quite a subconscious place. There's a wonderful book that I read many years ago by Stephen Gross, Gross, called The Examined Life. It's quite an old book now, but he talks about a client who told lies but wasn't a very good liar. And it turned out that he was one of three children. His mother didn't give him, because there was three children, couldn't give him a exclusive time. And in the night, he used to wet the bed, and he used to hide his pajamas under the pillow. He used to hide his pajamas at the bottom of the bed, and when he went to bed at night, he'd find that his pajamas were under the pillow, all washed. And his mother and him never had a conversation about it. And what happened was the dishonesty played out as this was the being dishonest brought the feelings of protection from his mother. It's a very Freudian position, I have to say, a very psychoanalytical position. But it's not always clear cut. That's what I'm saying, Ken. It's not always clear cut that why people tell lies. And I come back to this, and something you highlighted, that non-judgmental attitude and patience will I think in some cases bring rewards.
Wow. Yes, very much so. And it's interesting. The one thing that really rang out, it was like hitting a bell when you were saying that, Rory, is that honesty is not a prerequisite for therapy. It might be a therapeutic goal. Very often when a client is coming in, there's much of themselves that they hide from protection, from vulnerability, and it's understanding the whys of that, addressing deception when we come across it and normalizing that, not making a thing about it, and recognizing this is part of the process. There's no shaming here. There's no you did that wrong. Ha ha! I've caught you out. It raises questions, I think, and practical ways of working with it is normalizing that concealment, curiosity over confrontation, naming relational processes that you're going through. All of these mentioned in the handout that I will direct you to in the moment. Reflect in supervision, and this is a big one, and I do remember this, and I think that there's variance on this, Rory, because I did have an incident that I needed to take to supervision. I'm going to try and grey this as much as I can, but it became pretty clear that a client was actually making up stories pretty much on a weekly basis to have something to bring in to therapy, and it was kind of showing that the therapy was no longer accomplishing its original goal, but maybe this person felt that they had that need or a connection to this or an attachment to the therapy, and it felt like stories that were not true. It was like chapters of a book where it would be different on a regular basis. And I remember taking that into supervision and working through that with my supervisor and going out with a very different view and feel of how to work with that, because it's not how I would work with somebody who acted that way in my day-to-day life. So seeing that person for who they are and why they might be doing that. What is the goal behind that? Key takeaway, Rory?
Well, I think the key takeaway is don't take it personally if a client is telling lies. But if it becomes a pattern within the therapy room, certainly want to look at in supervision. Also, I think that to remember that all behaviour is goal-directed, understand the goal and you'll understand the behaviour, Roger's own words. And I also think it's very, very useful to view lies through a trauma-informed lens, because lying is a defence mechanism, and defence mechanisms are put in place as a form of protection. It can be protection for the ego or the self, but it can actually be, in another place at another time, protection, physical protection. Telling lies could literally save your life.
Mhm.
So being trauma-informed, looking at through a trauma-informed lens and looking at listening to the totality of the client's story may give you a different view and give you an approach that you can gently challenge, but without reactivating that historic trauma. It's very nuanced. Is how
It
I'd
is.
leave it, Ken. Very nuanced.
I like that. Yes, I've got a final key takeaway, and it's a quote from a book by Blackard and Faber. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It'll be in the show notes. It's called Secrets and Lies in Psychotherapy from 2018. And the quote is as follows: "The real reason we study client dishonesty has nothing to do with catching clients, but to learn how to foster honesty when our clients need it." I think that's a beautiful. And there is a handout for you. You can get that handout by going to counselingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab. You'll find all the show notes from today, and you'll find episode 356. That's today's episode, and you can download it from directly within that page. Rory, you've mentioned trauma-informed training on a number of occasions in this topic, because it does directly often link into trauma. And of course, if you're interested in becoming a trauma-informed therapist, Counselling Tutor have an incredible course with really, really good feedback. And you can find that by going to counselingtutor.com. Just click on our products. All our courses and training are there. And that is ethical, sustainable practice for today. So we move swiftly into practice matters. And Rory, you had that interview with Andrew Kidd on a topic that has been so greatly requested within our Facebook community. And if you want to join that, go to Facebook and type in Counselling Tutor. We're there. And it's on EMDR, Rory.
Yes. I spoke with Andrew Kidd, who is, as you'll hear in the interview, a 21st century therapist. He uses EMDR, eye movement and desensitization reprogramming therapy, to help clients with trauma. We had a very interesting conversation. It's going to be a two-part conversation. He's going to join us again in 2026, where we're going to have a part 2. And I'm going to share a little secret, Ken. He is going to be making a lecture, an overview, not training, but an overview of EMDR for the Counsellor CPD Library. 21st century therapy in action. And this is what Andrew had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counselor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counselingtutor.com.
Trauma is something that shows up again and again in many therapy rooms. For some clients, working through their experiences in therapy can be deeply helpful, even cathartic, allowing them to build or reframe their lives through approaches such as person-centered therapy, psychoanalytic work, or even cognitive behavioural therapy. But for others, a different approach may be needed. That's why I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Kidd, a qualified eye movement and desensitized reprogramming therapist, sometimes known as EMDR, who's here to share unique aspects of this fascinating evidence-based approach, and one that's described as a therapy for the 21st century. So Andrew Kidd, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here, Rory. I was saying just before we came on, I've watched the podcast with you and Ken for years. They say never meet your heroes, so let's see how this goes.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we'll see how you feel at the end of our time together. One of the things that we were discussing sort of off air before we pressed the record button was that Carl Rogers died in 1987, and Francine Shapiro, the late Francine Shapiro, developed or got her idea for EMDR in 1987. And for me, maybe it's just me, there seems like a demarcation point between 20th century phenomenological explorative therapies and therapies then moving more into the biological realm, understanding things like neurobiology and the way that trauma sits within, the brain. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I just thought it was quite a powerful date. The ending of one idea, or not the ending, but the ending of one theorist's life and the beginning of a whole new panoply of theory.
It's really significant and quite profound when you think about it, especially the exact date in 1987, because we were talking before about how Rogers, in my opinion, was so far ahead of his time. Rogers, a very, very radical thinker when he's challenging behaviourism and he's challenging the psychodynamic, psychoanalytical views that really dominated the early part of the years. So it's really interesting to see that therapy, when it's documented, a lot of us are familiar with the cognitive behavioural movements for the 70s onwards, but people assume EMDR is a new kid on the block. It's been about for quite a wee while now, going back to the 80s.
Yeah, I guess it only became mainstream, if that's a word, in the 2000s. And so for counsellors familiar with relational approaches, and I'm thinking here of person-centred therapy, how would you describe EMDR in a way that makes sense in their frame of reference?
I think what I'll do is I'll tell a story about the origins of EMDR, and then I'll link it up to something that people may be a little bit more familiar with. And for listeners who are unfamiliar, it helps make sure we're all on the same page as well. So to go back to the 80s, the story goes that Francine was walking through a forest. And as she got to the end of her walk, she realised that something she was thinking about, something that was troubling her, no longer had the same impact that it did from the beginning of the walk to the end of the walk. Not in like a typical way when you'd think about something and feel differently, in a really profound way where she felt it as an embodied experience. So she retraced her steps. And as she retraced her steps, she recognised that she was doing saccadic eye movements, saccadic left, right, left, right, left, right. She brought the image to mind and she started doing eye movements, and she noticed how she related to that image changed. And that interest in eye movements, like any good psychologist, she was very, very curious. And then she decided to start researching eye movements. And that was the starting point of what we understand as EMDR is nowadays. To say what it is, it's as you touched on before, Rory, it's an integrated neuro-informed approach to healing. So, and it's also multidimensional. So different things are happening at once when a client is engaging with the therapy. When we think about person-centered therapies or humanistic therapies or cognitive behavioural therapies, and they're talk therapies, whereas EMDR isn't a talk therapy, but it is an experiential therapy. So while EMDR is very highly structured, but it's also grounded in a therapeutic alliance where the therapist and client are working together collaboratively to help them recover from events that have brought them to therapy. So one of the key differences is the theory of change. So if you're working from a person-centered point of view, you might view that, okay, if the therapeutic relationship with specific conditions is involved, this is going to be the driver of change in the relationship. Whereas with EMDR, it's slightly different. The relationship is important, but it's more about memories, how we relate to them. And I'm sure we're going to go into that in a bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the key differences between what I call experiential therapies, I'm specifically talking about person-centered therapy here, but although some aspects of things like transactional analysis or even CBT can fall into that frame, I think, is that there is a a discovery process first. You don't get right into the therapy first. There's some groundwork that's done by therapists before you actually get into the if you like, the helping clients reprocess. Can you give us a sense of what that groundwork is, or what that early kind of intervention might look like?
Yeah. So before getting into the actual processing when it comes to EMDR, it's helpful to explain to clients a theory on how trauma manifests and how it's processed differently in the brain. So if we think about it, like when a trauma occurs, the amygdala, a part in the center of your brain that's responsible for emotions, the amygdala becomes overactivated and overwhelmed. A part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is a part of your brain that stores memory, this fails to integrate the experience. And the Broca's area, which is a point of the brain in the front here, and the Broca's area is responsible for speech, this can go offline. So with putting those three together, the overwhelmed sense of emotions, the difficulties integrating memory, the speech going offline, you can understand that after the event, it becomes really difficult for people to actually put into words what happened. So before getting involved in processing when it comes to EMDR, we need to ensure the client is safe. We need to ensure the client has the ability to self-regulate just a little bit. And one of the ways you describe it is we're looking for them to name the state, maintain the state, and navigate through the state. So if you just jump in to trauma processing, very, very unsafe and actually can be unethical for clients. But we're looking to build that confidence, build that safety, build that stability so that when we do eventually tackle the bigger memories, the bigger issues, the client's more prepared for it. So it can be a mixture of psychoeducation. It can be a mixture of grounding work, which people might be familiar with, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, diaphragmatic breathing, those sort of tools, and also some EMDR specific exercises.
Yes. So I guess what I'm hearing is that you're helping or observing how the client regulates themselves to keep them in the here and now, so they don't slide back into the there and then. They don't disappear in like the trauma time machine back into where the trauma happened. Yeah. I think that's very important. So I think that's a good practice for anyone who's working with trauma, be it EMDR therapist or a person-centered therapist who's trauma involved. Making sure the client's in the here and now.
That's it. And I know there's quite a famous quote. It's something like the client can only go as far as the therapist, right? So there's something about the therapist themselves needs to be very, very, very trauma informed, aware, not just from a theoretical point of view about trauma, but the client's experience, what they're bringing to therapy, because we don't want to just dive in with this idea of we've got this process, we've got these eye movements, just diving right in. We need to make sure the client's in a good enough place. And like all therapies, very early on in EMDR, you're doing the history taking. We can talk about the phases in a little bit, but you need that strong alliance. You need to build that alliance with the client so they can trust in you, and also you've got the trust in them that it is safe for both of you to continue. Yeah.
So there's the strong relational aspect. There's a strong relational aspect to this, which is always a joy, because all the research shows that the relationship's a key part to any positive therapeutic output for the clients. But yes, let's talk about those phases, because I think those are really interesting as well.
Where do you want to start?
Well, just talk us through. Client comes in the first session. How will those phases kind of present themselves? What's the journey, I guess?
What's the journey? I suppose it might help if I just talk you through what might happen if you were to come to me as my client and take you through the stages. So normally when a client comes to EMDR therapy, the first thing that I'm thinking about, you would go through the standard contract and client agreement, setting expectations, managing boundaries, as you would with any therapy. But from an EMDR perspective, you're thinking about a question, and the question is, what has happened in this person's life that's led them to think, feel, and respond in the way that they do now? So it's really looking at, okay, how can I understand this person? How can I understand their symptoms? Because symptoms are stories. How can I understand what's happened in their life that's brought them to therapy? So being more specific to the question, EMDR there's 8 phases in EMDR, and it takes a 3-pronged approach. So in EMDR, the formulation is focusing on past experiences, present triggers, and future resilience. If we go through the 8 phases very quickly, the first one is history taking. So when a client first comes in, think about it like a formulation. You're getting a sense of significant events that have happened that have influenced this person's health and well-being. During the history taking phase, what we're doing is we're trying to identify significant memories or experiences that the client would like to work on in therapy. And we can call these target memories. So for instance, maybe a client has experienced something last week, but then when you dig into it, they've experienced something when they were 5, when they were 8, when they were 10. So we're building up a picture of their history, getting their history. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is preparation. And that's the phase we were touching on just a little bit before about we're giving some psychoeducation to help the client understand their experiences, their trauma. You maybe use something like the window of tolerance just as a tool to explain, like how they're making sense of their experiences. Phase 2 is quite a fun phase because this is where you can flex a little bit. When I was trained, Michael Patterson, Michael told us, look, you bring what you already know into EMDR. So if you're a therapist who's used to using maybe acceptance commitment therapy, talking about psychological flexibility, maybe you're used to doing behavioural experiments, maybe you're used to doing breathing techniques, maybe you're a mindfulness-based practitioner, whatever it could be, we're bringing in as much tools as you have and also adding in some EMDR specific tools. And these could be, for instance, the safe place, light stream, container. There's different ways of working with a person, but really this is the phase where we're helping make sure a client can ground themselves enough so they can regulate. So normally different therapists work in different ways, but for me, the first session is a history session, the second session is a preparation session. So then you're moving into phase 3. So phase 3 is called activation, sometimes known as assessment as well. And what you're doing here is you are activating the target memory. So let's just say we are choosing to focus on something that's happened in your personal life, like an assault or something like that. We're really, really focusing in on activating this memory. When we do that, that's when we move into phase 4, which is where the eye movements come in. We start the desensitization process. Phase 4 is desensitization. When we've desensitized the memory, we move on to installation, which is trying to link the previously maladaptively stored memory to something more adaptive, or in plain English, make sure the brain can make sense of this experience in the here and now. Then it moves on to body scan, which is, as the name suggests, scanning through, looking for any leftover disturbance in the body. Phase 7 is closure, where we wrap up the session. And then phase 8 is re-evaluation, where at the next session following a processing session, you're looking to check in with the client about their previous experience of therapy, if the memory needs more work or if we can move on to another target. So I've shared quite a lot of you, but I remember Mark Brain. Mark Brain uses the metaphor something like Harry Potter and Dumbledore in a big cheesy relationship. So history, prep, assessment, desensitization, installation, body scan, closure, re-evaluation. Your first 2 phases, 1 and 2, that's your preparation. 3 onwards, that's your processing. And that's a lot of information there, but
yeah, I think it's worth mentioning at this point that EMDR isn't something that you can do a 10-hour CPD on. It is a full training course. Just tell us a little bit about what that course comprises of. What type of course is it? And where do you have to be in your career to be able to access that training?
Yeah. So the course is split up into 3 parts. It's a very, very intensive training where the first part is very much focused on building the theoretical foundations and understandings of EMDR. And even that day, the very first day, they get you into skills practice with other colleagues as well. Following part 1 of the training, you're encouraged to go use and practice EMDR with clients. Or what I did for myself is I was very open to people. I'm a student, EMDR therapist, I'm training, and I did clients pro bono, just to build up skills. Then your second part of your training is after a few months, you return to the course. This is more about supervision, case consultations, discussing with other colleagues, refining your skills that little bit. After that training, you go ahead to build up more experience. And in the third part of the training, it adds in more tools and techniques and methods. It really, really refines it, where maybe you could work with specific client populations. Maybe you can learn new ways of working in the different phases of EMDR. So in terms of getting on the training for myself, I had to be accredited. So I'm senior accredited with the BACP at the minute. The reason for that, and this is where it gets quite controversial for some people, they can see that as like gatekeeping, which I can understand, because accreditation means different things to different people. And we could do a whole podcast on that on itself, you know. But the whole reason behind accredited is because, like I said before, EMDR builds on what you already know. So there's an expectation that you can client contract, you can maintain boundaries, you can manage a situation if maybe there's an abreaction within a client, you can manage your practice overall, you know, all the practicals in terms of admin and GDPR. It really fires you in at the deep end, you know. So if people are looking to train, there's a few different training providers here in the UK. I'm very biased for Michael Patterson with EMDR Masterclass. There's also EMDR Works, Matt Wesson. There's Sandy Rishman. There's some fantastic trainers, but the key would be making sure that they are accredited with the EMDR Association UK.
Okay. And what we'll do is, for those of you who are listening, we will put a link in the show notes. If you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, hit on episode 356. If you look at the show notes, we will make sure we put some really useful links on for those of you who might be interested. One of the things that really struck me is that demarcation point when you're working with clients. So a lot of therapists, including myself, are trauma-informed therapists. So you've talked about window of tolerance, you've talked about the breathing, you've talked about how people are activated. I think anyone who's done any trauma-informed training would know about that and be informed and be able to do that. At what point would a therapist think, maybe I need a referral, maybe this client needs something other than my modality? In other words, maybe EMDR. And I know that, you know, the NICE guidelines, which in the UK is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, I think, if I've got my acronyms right, it's a recommended pathway for within the National Health Service for trauma work. I guess my question is, at what point is that a demarcator? How would you think to yourself as a therapist, maybe this client needs something else?
I think immediately my brain goes to two separate places. The first one is standard. I'll be led by the client and their experiences. I'll be reviewing session progress with the client. Is what we're doing in the room therapeutic? Is my way of working with this person actually helpful? Do they need something a little bit different? Sometimes what happens is clients will do so much work with another therapist, and then they'll feel like they'd like to engage in EMDR. And then when they come to EMDR, they're not looking for the deep-rooted exploration, you know, that you would in therapy. They're looking to come at it and hit the ground running. So I'd say it really depends on where the client is at. It really depends on the therapist themselves. You know, do they feel like they're able to offer something therapeutic to this client? And I think it's also really important to say that EMDR, it can be really profound and really meaningful, but it's not to say that it's any more effective than any other therapy, right? And that's, I suppose, a bone of contention. It's a debated upon subject, right? What is the best therapy? And for me, the best therapy, it's a personal decision. It's not a clinical one. So when I would know as being led by the client, and there's also something about sometimes particular issues, maybe, for instance, one of the benefits of EMDR is that the therapist doesn't actually need to know the details, the gory details of a particular event. So maybe a client's working with a therapist and there's a particular issue they don't want to talk about, but they do want to work on. EMDR can be quite useful in that regard as well.
Yes, I've got a dear friend who's had a lot of therapy for childhood trauma, and one of the things she observed was that a lot of therapists had helped her a long way along the path of recovery. She'd had many encounters, and each one of those encounters set her on a new journey, and then she'd have another encounter. But with the EMDR, the effect was quite profound for her. Now, I'm only talking about one person. It was very profound. But as a therapist herself, she was struck by the mechanism of it, because it was nothing that she'd ever experienced before. The actual, I guess you've hinted to it or pointed to it, reprogramming side. The fact that there's a sense that, you know, you're building yourself a new operating system, to use computer language.
Yeah. I mean, we could definitely talk about the mechanism. It's really interesting. I'm glad you brought it up. So how does EMDR work? Is a massive question. When you look up EMDR online, that's one of the, how does it work? And I'm ready to tell everyone, if they're listening, if they're ready, we don't know.
We'll just put the edit there then. Yeah.
Edit there, that's what I've done. He's a charlatan, he's a fraud. No. So on a more serious vein, so we've got theories, but the neurological studies are still trying to work out the exact mechanism. We know it works, we just don't know exactly why. But to do a little bit better, so EMDR, it engages the neurobiological processes that help the brain rebalance emotion and cortical activity. Plain English, it's helping your brain heal itself by engaging natural healing mechanisms. So research has been shown to reduce the vividness of disturbing memories, reduce the emotional intensity of memories when they're paired up with eye movements. And EMDR relies on the brain's associative capacity and memory network. And using the eye movements and other forms of bilateral stimulation, this is all about facilitating processing. So if I think about Rory describing how EMDR works, imagine you were my client. So what I'd get a client to do is I'd ask them to complete a sentence. So Rory, if I were to say to you, roses are red, you would say
violets are blue.
Gold star. Wouldn't say that to a client. No. Violets are blue. When is the last time you thought about that, Rory? Roses are red, violets are blue. And...
Probably not recently.
But how hard did you have to work to bring that to mind?
Not hard at all.
And that's where I start with clients, because roses are red and violets are blue. So to build on that idea, our brains are geared towards survival. It survives by solving problems. And it solves problems by creating automatic reactions. So for the listeners as well, I promise we didn't do that before we came on air. I promise we didn't. But the whole idea is roses are red, violets are blue. Beans means Heinz, you know.
Yeah, all the beans are available. We have to say that.
You can tell it's lunchtime and we're doing the podcast. So the brain makes these automatic reactions. It jumps ahead. Yeah. So EMDR is based on the adaptive information processing model, the AIP model. So that suggests that many psychological difficulties stem from unprocessed or maladaptively stored memories or distressing experiences. To put that in plain English, it's almost like when we are disturbed by an experience, it's almost like that experience gets stuck with our original thoughts, feelings, sights, smells, sounds, sensations, as is what happened at the time of the event. And because those memories get stored in an unhelpful way, the brain and body haven't got any access to adaptive information. So when those memories are triggered, the original emotions, beliefs, bodily sensations, those resurface and cause a reaction. So when we are talking about roses are red and violets are blue, and other beans are available, we can have a wee joke about it. But you can imagine if someone's experienced a traumatic event, roses are red could become a person's face, and violets are blue could become panic and fear.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
So when you think about how memories are stored and the hippocampus, if we think about the hippocampus like a librarian, and the librarian catalogues and stores events properly in their place. But with traumatic events, they can overwhelm the hippocampus, and this can leave memories becoming unprocessed. And those raw memories can become easily triggered, and that causes them to replay and create distress. So what typically happens is, you've probably heard clients say it, and I know it rationally, but so what's happening is the memory networks, the memory is the person's connecting to their memory network. They're aware they're in the present. They know they're in the here and now. They know, but their body is re-experiencing the event. So the mind remembers, the body re-experiences, and the body gets the past and the present mixed up. They start to almost re-experience that distress.
This has been an absolute fascinating conversation. I've learned so much in such a short space of time. And if you are listening to this and you're interested in being an EMDR therapist, want to explore more, as I said earlier, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, hit the podcast tab, episode 356, we'll put some links in and you can explore that. It just goes for me to say, Andrew Kidd, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Andrew Kidd and to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions, bringing us all the lowdown on EMDR. As mentioned in leading into this, Andrew is in the process of building a lecture for the Counsellor CPD library on this. If you're a member, log in and look out for that. It'll be be under the upcoming lectures. If you're not a member, go to counsellingtutor.com, click on our products tab. Our library is open to any qualified practitioner. So that is Practice Matters. We now move on to Student Services. And today in Student Services, we are going to be speaking about AI and plagiarism in counselling training. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com. Interesting topic. I think it's the right time to be having this topic, Rory, lead us in.
Yes, so this came up as part of a Facebook post in our Facebook group. And a brief overview is somebody's had their assignment rejected because the tutors believe that it's been developed or used by AI, and that is against the academic standards. Now, I'm not going to talk specifically about this discussion in the Facebook group, but we want to discuss generally about the difficulty that both students and, I guess, tutors have regarding plagiarism. And just to be clear, plagiarism is where you're presenting somebody else's work as your own. So you're asked to write 300 words on Freud, and what you do is you go on the internet and you find someone who's done a blog post and you copy and paste it into your assignment and you present that as your own work. That's one form of plagiarism. But another is that you go to the many large language models, sometimes known as AI or chat GPTs, and you type in, write me 300 words on the work of Freud, and you go and have a cup of tea and you come back and the AI has produced it. You copy and paste that and you present it. Now, the difficulty that academics are having is that with normal plagiarism, i.e. you've copied and pasted from someone's blog post, we put the assignment through a plagiarism checker, in other words, a program that checks if anything's been copied, and it will highlight it. It will look on the internet overnight and it'll say, well, this has been drawn from this blog post. With AI, it's very, very difficult. And it's my understanding, and I may be proved wrong, that there's very few, or there isn't any AI checkers that can absolutely 100% say it's generated by AI, and it's causing fracture. It's causing a fracture. This is the word I'm looking for. A fracture in training between trainer and the student. So I think there's two conversations here, Ken. One is how we use AI to help with assignment writing, to help, not to write it. And I think the other is how work is assessed. Is assessing work by assignment a bit 20th century? Are there other ways of assessing work that might be actually better for the learner?
Oh, now I like where we're going on this, because I know that we are going to our roving correspondent in just a few moments, Sarah Henry, who's going to be speaking exactly about what you've just mentioned there, about maybe different ways of looking at the assessment and how that is done and whether that needs re-looking at. Before we go there, I wanted to refer to a document. So there is in the United Kingdom, we have the Joint Council for Qualifications, which I will now refer to as the JCQ, and I'm referring to a document of theirs, the second revision, the most up to date at the moment of this podcast recording. And it is called AI Use in Assessments, Your Role in Protecting the Integrity of Qualifications. And this is a document that has been made for tutors. And it is in the hands of many tutors that deliver counselling and psychotherapy training. So what this JCQ document guidance requires is the following. It requires that all work submitted by qualification assessment must be the student's own work. Now, there's nothing different there. It has always been that way. You go and you do training, and then you do assignments and you hand them in. It's going to be your own work. So you've spoken about the way of plagiarism before, where you'd find somebody else's paper or article and use that, Rory. Now looking at AI as a way of kind of generating those as well. It can be picked up. If an AI-generated content is used, it has to be clearly acknowledged and appropriately referenced. That's an interesting one, and we'll get a little bit deeper onto what that is. So if they're saying you have to do it yourself, but if you use AI, then you got to reference it, it's kind of, well, where's the line here? When do I use AI and where can't I? And I think that what we need to do is I can give you a link to the document where you can look at it. But if you're using an AI tool, you want to be treating it as an idea partner or a very high-level thinking partner, or as a source. So you don't want to be using it for the work itself. You want to be working with your coursework and the textbooks that you've been given. And if you are, so you might say, I want to write about this, and where best would I put this paragraph? And it might help you, a paragraph that you wrote yourself, it might help you where you might put that in and structure it best. Consequences for non-compliance, and you mentioned that there was a post in our Facebook group, and I think we're going to see more and more of this. We've certainly spoken about it a number of times of what this might look like. But if your work is judged not to be your own or contains undeclared AI-generated content, it may be flagged as malpractice, and that is the word that is being used at the moment, malpractice. And that's very interesting, isn't it, that we can be in malpractice while we're still studying. I always thought it only represented practice, but within this document, that's what they are alluding to, Rory. So what does it mean for counselling trainees on UK courses? Well, you may use AI tools as a source, for example, to generate the initial ideas or help you think through a topic or to do a draft. So you wouldn't use it to do a draft of the theory, but an outline of what you might be writing. And you must demonstrate in your own voice, your own view of that, and theory and practice. And that's the key here, Rory. I think this is the main bit for me, is in counselling training, it's unlike any other training really, because we're asked to speak about our own journey, how we experienced it, what we took to supervision, what our supervisor said, how that impacted us, how that made us decide to change what we were doing or not change what we were doing, and implement that within our practice. Now, in the beginning of counselling training, you're working on clear theories, like what are Carl Rogers's XYZs, and you'd need to go and look in your textbooks and find that theory and say, look, I know what the theory is. But that's only at the lower levels. As soon as you progress and you're taking this further, you're bringing yourself into it, and you cannot use AI for that. It doesn't know. It cannot replicate your experience and how you felt it, and that's what you're being asked for in those assignments, Rory.
Absolutely, and I think it speaks to two things. One is that AI is relatively new in the academic field, and I think that tutors, I'm sure tutors are doing this, are putting the expectations of how AI is used when they're briefing the class. So I think the first thing is, students need to know what is acceptable use of AI, and you've outlined that beautifully, Ken, but also what is not acceptable. So the expectations are set. And also I think that a lot of tutors, and we're going to hear from our academic correspondent on this, is that there's lots of ways of assessing work, and sometimes that's not written. It can be an oral testimony. It can be tutor observation. It can be lots of things. So I think as AI comes in and will happily write you an assignment, I think assessment is moving away from that, and moving away from all assignment to more creative ways of knowing and understanding what information has sunk in, for want of a better word, into the students. You could actually look at the student, listen to the student, or observe the student, and get perhaps a better understanding of what they know and how they're going to evidence it.
Yeah. So before we go over to our roving reporter Sarah Henry on this, to a deeper look at this topic, I want to hit you with some hard bullet points here. So the essence of the JCQ guidance, which is from April 2025, the latest edition that I was able to get my hands on. AI doesn't change the rule. Your work must still be your own. AI tools can be used, but must be declared, referenced, and personalized. Undeclared or over-reliant on AI equals academic malpractice. Whoa, that word makes the hairs on my arms stand up, Rory. Assessors must only accept work they're confident is genuine. And even declared AI uses no marks unless you demonstrate your own learning. So where you do reference the AI, you have to demonstrate that you did some learning around that, not just pop that in. Why it matters: counselling training assesses you. We've said that it's your voice, it's your reflection, it's your supervisions, it's your insights. AI can't reflect on your personal development or the therapeutic process. It just can't. Case studies, journals, self-reflections must be done authentically by you, because it's lived experiences, and AI doesn't live. If you're using AI too heavily, it flattens your authenticity. And think of AI as a brainstorming buddy. Something you might say to a fellow student on your course. Oh, I'm going to be doing my assignment. I'm going to be doing this and this and this and this. What do you think about it? And use it in that way. And if you are using it, you must reference it. So an example declaration: use ChatGPT on the 2nd of May 2025 to generate the initial ideas, edited and expanded with my own reflections. Keep any chat logs and keep the URLs from them, because they are shareable, and you can share them with a tutor if they do asks for that. But I think it all comes down to, Rory, with what is assessment and how is it done, and is it fit for today's world? And You met up with Sarah, didn't you, to discuss this in a little bit more depth?
Yeah, so we're joined by Sarah Henry, our academic correspondent and principal lecturer at Greenwood Counselling Academy in Nottingham. So welcome, Sarah. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Do you know, I'm very well. And I'm slightly perplexed, to be honest, about this, growing challenge within education of AI being used, and the sort of divide that, if we're not careful, can start between tutors and students. And as Ken and myself have discussed, there isn't really an effective AI plagiarism checker. It is, with great respect to my colleagues who teach, it's kind of a bit of a, well, there's lots of ways of working it out, which we won't discuss. But what I would say is that sometimes it's an educated guess. And There's lots of ways we can evidence that educated guess, which I'm not going to disclose. So it does bring us, I guess, to how do we work effectively with our students in terms of assessment? How do you do it as a trainer?
So as a trainer and a centre manager, I think the first thing for me to honestly own is that technology is not my area of strength. And with the responsibility I have within my organisation, I had to own that with humility in order to then face the impact of AI and plagiarism, etc., within the establishment that I run in order for us to maintain our integrity. I don't know what I don't know, but I do know that the quality of these courses that are being run has never exclusively hinged on the written work that students produce. So that for me was the main thing, is that yes, AI and technology is being introduced at a pace that I don't fully understand. However, there are other elements of the training environment, the developmental elements, the observable evidence from me as a tutor that AI can't impact. And those elements of the training experience are the ones that, for us, with the topic of counselling, those relational aspects, the self-awareness aspects, thankfully for me, they are equally as rich as the 2,000-3,000 words that students can produce in an essay. So my approach was to stay open-minded to the advances in technology, but also appreciate that churning out words was not the only way that students are assessed.
So what we're talking about here is assessment, how we as tutors can evidence, because this is the thing, this is sometimes forgotten. We're not the final judges, for want of a better word, on whether a student has passed the work. Anybody who teaches a course is teaching a specification that's driven by an external body. So CPCAB provide a specification, and they will send out an examiner to look over the whole work and say if you've hit the specification, an external verifier. So what you're talking about is finding new and different ways of evidencing student knowledge without relying on the written word. So the key thing is, how do you do it?
Well, the way that we do it is tutors really paying attention to the observable elements of what happens in the 420 hours of a diploma or the 90 hours of levels 2 and 3 that we run, facilitating group discussions and actually inviting people's voices into those discussions. We can then, as a CPCAB centre, award criteria based on what it is that we see and hear. We as tutors also make an incredibly intentional effort to develop relationships with our individual learners, understanding how it is that they use language, what it was that happened in the session, so that when they do write the work, we can get a flavour of, this person doesn't quite sound like how they did in the classroom. It doesn't sound like the person that I've come to know. But we are heavily leaning on the relational aspect of this field as tutors. We are in a relationship with our students, and that relationship is far richer than the words they can produce on paper. So we lean into that by facilitating the different ways that we can engage with them beyond printed submission.
Yeah, and as you say, there's modern schemes of work or modern specifications, and I would urge tutors to look at this. I don't want to teach people how to suck eggs here, but the relying just on the assignment to evidence is a bit 20th century now. Even universities are looking at new and creative ways of testing students' knowledge that doesn't rely on the very dry assignment criteria. So one of the things that we did in my final years as teaching was record. We would record something or video something, and then we would award criteria based on what we'd observed. And there's different ways of evidencing them. So as a very progressive trainer, which clearly you are, what you're doing is you're trying to find new and different ways of evidencing the criteria.
Absolutely that. And for us, again, at Greenwood, in our scheme of work, it's very much, your homework is to reflect on your experience in the class, but also go and listen to this non-counselling podcast, because we're going to be discussing elements of it in detail in the session. That is homework that you can't dip out of, because if you're not listening to it and consuming that podcast in some way, shape or form, you're not going to be able to do the work in the classroom that then evidences your ability. So we're trying to think far broader than the written word. And the reality of the world that we're living in is that technology has always developed. I remember being at school and being told by my teachers, you need to be really good at mathematics because you're not going to live with a calculator in your pocket all the time. In came the iPhone and that idea was shut out of the water, but it doesn't mean that maths in itself is redundant. It means that the assessment has had to change in order to accommodate that development. So I see the counselling field in the same way. Is once upon a time you could evidence something from a 3,000 word essay. Now it may be that AI could do that. So how can we make sure that we're evidencing the knowledge and ability and not just the production of work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that essay and lecture is becoming evidenceably less effective as a way of helping learners learn. I think that most of us who are trained as teachers know the power of vicarious learning. So if you think of a triangle, at the top of the triangle, the very narrow bit right at the peak, is sitting in front of a lecture and taking notes. Because you without the context, it's very, very difficult to kind of be very nuanced about what you learn. And when you get to the bottom of the pyramid, the very flat, wide, thick base, there's vicarious learning where you learn off others by practicing, by doing. And, I think in terms of evidence, that's where the rich evidence is. You could get so much more out of that by observation than you can by people committing to the written word. I know if I was asked to write an assignment on something, may not give the full breadth of my intellect because I'm terrible at bloody writing, to be honest. I'm awful at it. That's why I do a podcast.
There's lots of research when it comes to, child development, but of course that development doesn't stop the moment you turn 18, where there's what's called the zone of proximal development. And that is that when students are paired with each other, or learners are paired with each other, that there is an additional zone of learning that opens up when somebody is supported by a peer that has more knowledge. Equally, that peer that has more knowledge, their knowledge is further anchored and cemented because they're supporting somebody else's understanding. So as tutors, we can work within that remit if we develop a scheme of work that's sophisticated enough to accommodate the beauty of the relationships our courses hinge on, and the fact that we're not heavily reliant on that one-way lecture and then independent essay writing format.
Yeah, Yeah, and I'm sure there's lots of tutors who'll be listening, because we're now talking really to tutors as well as learners, who'll be saying, but Rory, I do that already. I don't want to be told off by my learners that I'm not doing that. I do that already. I'm sure there's a lot of very progressive educators out there in the field who are doing that. But I think the danger is that with assignments and only, is that it can create a barrier between the tutor and the learner. That intellectual closeness can be pushed into a big gap. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we have to have new and more novel ways of knowing, because the relationship in teaching is as important as it is in therapy, I think. It's different, but it's as important. What are your thoughts, Sarah?
I totally agree with you. I think that when it comes to facilitating a classroom environment and the culture that I want to build as a tutor, it's not a million miles away from the environment I want to build as a therapist. It's still one that hinges on trust. It's still one that hinges on respect. And it's one that hinges on the intentional growth of one person, but the simultaneous growth of us both as people who are relating to each other. And so as a tutor, I've never heavily relied on what is written. And in the classroom, for me, it's about what is experienced. And if I'm teaching students and facilitating their learning about the richness of a relationship and an experience, then I also want to be modeling that when they are experiencing me in the classroom. So it's a challenge, and it's something that constantly ebbs and flows when groups dynamic change and working across levels. It's a different presentation, but we are about relationships. That's what this entire field is about. The role of counsellor and client is one way of relating that we intentionally teach, but we are in another type of relationship, which, when it works well, is incredibly fruitful for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if you are a tutor listening to this, I know this section of the podcast is really for learners, but if you are a tutor, where would be best for tutors to reach out and develop a kind of collegial meeting space to be able to talk about different ideas of assessment? Where might you go to kind of get some ideas or meet people?
So the Greenwood tutors, my trusted team, we have a culture which is very much all our ideas go into the mixing pot and we share them. When we're in the office, it's I've had this thought, I've had this idea. You know, I saw this on social media, and I was wondering if just to keep our minds open and expansive to all of the ways in which we can bring the richness that exists in the world into the classroom, and to kind of think outside of that rigid box of what education should be. So we start by actually challenging our ideas and our own conditions of worth of, well, who do I need to be in order to be a good tutor?
Yeah.
And perhaps maybe some of those ideas are redundant because they come from who it is that we had at school as children. And so being playful across our team with both Stacey and Sam here, being playful with the ideas, being honest as to whether or not they'll land as activities is the first point for me. The second one is going to the awarding body.
Yes.
Go to the awarding body and understand what the parameters are of the specification that they've provided, because it may well be that with the best intention, the slight misunderstanding that you had when you became a tutor 5, 10, 15 years ago, you have ran with it, and it has calcified into an incredibly rigid way of now being in the classroom. And a conversation with those that are there to support you would actually open you up to ideas that not only better serve students and better combat the issues that technology can provide, but a lot of the time can also take some of the strain out of tutoring and inject some of the joy again. So trust the people that you have around you, and open up a mixing pot, and then also trust the awarding body and push what may be the calcified barriers in your own mind.
Well, I think that's brilliant. So Sarah, Henry, thank you so much for joining us, and it's back to you, Ken, in the studio.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Rory. And that is our student services, AI plagiarism in counselling training. Again, we'll pop into the show notes, definitely, what we've discussed today and all those bullet points, things you need to know and remember, and a link to that document that I described, the JCQ, AI use in assessment, dual role in protecting the integrity of qualifications. And you can get that by going to episode 356 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, which you'll find by going to our website, counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go to episode 356, and the show notes are there. And that, Rory, brings us to the end of episode 356, Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yeah, so we started off with ethical and sustainable practice, why clients lie in therapy, a deep dive into why clients may not tell the truth, how we respond, and what practical use of supervision can we draw on to help us support the clients and give the client the best service possible. In Practice Matters, I caught up with the fabulous Andrew Kidd, who talked about eye movement desensitization and reprogramming therapy, a truly 21st century therapy, in the first of a two-part interview. And also, terribly excited about this, a lecture for this Counsellor CPD library incoming. We'll keep you updated with that. And in student services, we talked about the thorny issue of AI and plagiarism in counselling training. And of course, we thank our academic correspondent, Sarah Henry, for her fantastic input. As always, we thank you for your likes, shares and subscribes. And until the next time we meet, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.